Hi, and welcome to another episode of Starship Gaming. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell if you want notifications of when we release more awesome videos. Now let's jump right into today's topic. Now, this is a question that people have been asking me for well over a year now, and it has to pertain to mini consoles. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the term, which you shouldn't be, mini consoles are more or less just, or I should say retro mini consoles specifically, are just basically just little dedicated consoles that have a set amount of built-in games. And that's pretty much what they are. They just have old games built into them. Not built in, but you get the picture. They're in there. The thing I've been asked for a while now is, do I think that mini consoles will thrive in the early 2020s? But before we can answer that, we have to go back to where, well, there's a timeline. But let me say this. The whole retro mini console craze really kicked off when the NES Mini came out a couple years ago. And then it went crazy from there. You had the NES Mini, then they discontinued it, and then they had the SNES Mini, then they brought the NES Mini back, and then the PlayStation Classic. Should I be calling them minis? I call them minis. I think they're called NES Classics. Actually, that's what they are. They are NES Classics. NES Classics, SNES Classic. You had the PlayStation Classic, which failed miserably because of a number of factors. A lot of mishandling at Sony on that one. Sony should be embarrassed about that one. And that's probably why we won't see another PlayStation Classic Mini ever again. If we do, it would have to really pull off something. The first thing it had going wrong for it was the price. $99 for 20 little measly games. And most of the games weren't even that good. That's what was really sad about it. Of course, the PlayStation Classic Mini was really customizable and whatnot. I guess you could call it customizable. You could mod it real easily. So it had that going for it. But now you got the Sega Genesis, I guess it's called a Classic Mini. You have that's currently on the market. I think that's actually the only Mini that's actually on the market right now. Other than, whatever backstock they have of PlayStation Classics. But I think that's like one of the only few. I mean, then of course you have the at-game ones, but we're getting way off track. We need to start at the beginning of how this whole craze actually started. So the whole nostalgia factor really kicked in. It actually started over 25 years ago, 1995. People were wanting to play the older video games, notably Atari games. This was around 1995, and you had companies that were releasing PC games that had the older games on them, the older arcade games, and some of the old Atari 2600 titles. And then, of course, you had these small collections of games that were coming out, and they were releasing them on Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. So that's really where the origins of this started. And then as you moved on through the rest of the 90s, by 97, 98, 99, they were churning out these remakes, you could say. Hasbro Interactive, which owned the rights to Atari at that time, was churning out these games. Like, you had the originals being released, and then you had all these 3D remakes coming out for PC and PlayStation 1. Of course, you had Most notably, the most popular one that was released of the era was the 3D remake of Frogger, which actually got a release on Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, but they were... I'm trying to think which one it was. I believe the Sega Genesis one was based on the arcade port. Actually, I think it was a port of the arcade, so it was not 3D. And the Super Nintendo version, I don't think was based on any existing port. I think it was a brand new port made. I'm not 100% sure on that, because it looks completely different from the Sega Genesis version, if I remember correctly. And that was just the first, I guess you could say, pocket of retro stuff. And then, of course, you had people who, by the late 90s, were craving in television. I believe it was in 1999. There was a plug and play, which plug and plays started becoming a common thing by the late 90s. Companies started releasing these, and I believe that there was a Intellivision plug and play released in 1999, because I remember seeing it at an Ames department store, and I wanted one. It was in their electronics section. It was either 99 or 2000, I forget. And I didn't get it for whatever reason. I don't know if it was just I completely forgot about it. It was during one of our yearly shopping trips. Well, I should say yearly Christmas shopping trips. What it was is we would go to Ames in like September or October. Or we would go to like Kmart or Walmart. Or before Ames, we had Hills. We would go to Hills. Or, during this time, I was obsessed with Ames for whatever reason. I don't know what it is. I guess they had a better selection of toys than my local Kmart had. And, of course, they offered layaway, which was a plus. Back in the 90s, layaway was a big thing. That was how your parents could say, what do you want? We're going to put on layaway and blah, blah, blah. Santa's going to bring it to you. That was just, the way of getting everything in one shot and not having to worry about any last-minute Christmas shopping. But that was something that my parents did. I remember seeing one of these Intellivision plug-and-plays. That was the first time I ever saw anything like that. And then, when you move on to the early 2000s, you had Jack's Pacific, who released an Atari plug-and-play. I think it was between 2002 and 2004. I ended up getting one around 2004. And I think I bought mine, I believe it was from a local Walmart. It was on sale. I believe it was $14.99. And it had like 20 games or something. I forget how many. Was probably 10 games probably. I forget exactly how many they had. It's been a long time ago. And that was when you had these plug and plays, when it really started kicking off. And of course, Jack's Pacific continued releasing plug and plays for years, and then eventually they stopped. And in 2004, you had the introduction of the Atari Flashback, which this was the beginning of a true retro mini console. This was the actual beginning of one. And the thing about the very first Atari Flashback, it was an NES on a chip, which really bugged a lot of people. And the Flashbacks actually used NES ports for years on their mini consoles, which bugged a lot of people. I think the really interesting thing about the first Atari Flashback is it's modeled to look like an Atari 7800. I really like for some reason, I don't know what it is about the Atari 7800. I like the way that you push the button on it, the power button. I don't know, it just feels so smooth, and then there's this like bump and you just press it and it turns on. The only bad design about the Atari 7800 button is that it breaks so easily. I have worked in the retro gaming retail industry, I guess you could say, for, over 10 years now. But I've seen well over 100 Atari 7800 consoles over the past 10 years go through my shop, or ones that I've sold. I had in the early 2010s, about 2011, about 2010, 2011, 2012, early 2012. I basically sold at flea markets, and I saw, probably in about a three and a half year time span, I saw probably close to around 10 Atari 7800s. For some reason, in West Virginia, they are more common to find than any other place in the world. I don't know why. I guess it's just where, at the time that they sold them, people bought them because they were cheaper than the Nintendo. Of course, you have to remember West Virginia was, and for the most part still is, low income. So the 7800 was the perfect console to market in this area. Of course, a lot of the people here already owned 2600 games, which was backwards compatible, which was just perfect. But a lot of the information that I know about the 7800 selling in this area is from a friend of mine who comes into my shop frequently. He is in his 60s, and he said that when he used to work for Montgomery Ward in my hometown, he said that the 7800 probably sold more consoles, the Atari 7800 sold more consoles than the NES in West Virginia until at least 1989. He said 1989 was the year that he said that Nintendo in West Virginia really took off. And he said that he had worked for Montgomery Ward up until they closed in my hometown. I believe it was 2000 they closed, or I'm pretty sure it was 2000. And he said that the 7800 was just one of the best-selling ones that he had ever seen in his retail experience. And he had worked for him for years. He'd worked for him, I believe, since '84 at Montgomery Ward. But I just thought that was a little interesting tidbit to mention. I know it's off topic, but I just wanted to get into that because it's just an interesting story. Now let's get right back into our topic. So you had the Atari Flashback that was coming out in 2004, 2005. And in addition to that, you had Jack's Pacific, who was also selling their own little Atari thing. And eventually, I guess they stopped because the Flashback came out. Might have been something with the rights. And I do know that Jack's Pacific, I believe that they really tried to break into the market really, really hard in the 2000s. I remember specifically a lot of their little mini, they're not mini consoles, but they're plug and plays. I should correct myself. I remember seeing a lot of them at my local Family Dollar and Dollar General circa 2005, 2006. And in 2005, I actually bought a Star Wars plug and play that Jack's Pacific made. Had I think it was 5 built-in games or something. And I remember buying a SpongeBob one too, so. And also around 2004, 2005, we had something that was basically a mini plug and play / console, so to speak. And that was called the Super Power Joy 3. These came out around I think I started seeing them pop up in flea markets around 2004, 2005. And this was before... Well, let me explain what they had on them. It was basically this little plug-and-play / mini console. I guess you could call it a mini console, technically. That had a bunch of NES games built in. Most of them had 75, but they advertised as having 75,000. And, most of them were like palette swaps, or they started at a different level, or it had like ROM hacks on them of stuff. And these were extremely popular. People were buying these up like crazy. And at the time, they were deemed by Nintendo illegal, because at that point the NES had not. I guess you could say it's real weird. Like, if you look, let me give you an example. The Retron 1 plays NES games. This thing, technically, it plays games. You can use cartridges on it, but it uses Famicom cartridges. It does not take the American or European NES cartridges. So it's technically a console, because it has to where you can put a Famicom cartridge on the back of this little Nintendo 64 style controller, which is the console itself. But it also had a bunch of like illegal ROMs built into it. And there's various stories of how the whole thing went down, how Nintendo did a wide sweep and got these things off the market within a year. And there's various rumors and stories as to how this all went down. One of the most common ones that I hear, which it's probably just something that somebody came up with on the internet and put on there, or it may have been based on a story that they heard. But one of the stories goes that there was a mall kiosk. The setting is a mall, and there was a kiosk in the middle of the mall right nearby a GameStop, and they were selling these things, and the manager of that particular GameStop got really pissed off and decided to turn this person in because he was taking sales away from GameStop. And this was probably like circa 2005. That's how the story goes. That's one of the stories that when I do read about this subject, that's one of the stories I hear commonly. But what happened was Nintendo came in, got all these off the market, and by the end of 2006, they were mostly gone. The only place you could find them after 2006 was in flea markets. Of course, they show up all the time in thrift stores and retro gaming stores, these things do. Used, of course. And at this point, Nintendo doesn't really care if they're still on the market or not. They haven't been in production for at this point, they haven't been in production, I believe, in about 13 or 14 years. So Nintendo's not really too concerned about used ones getting out there anymore. In fact, if there was some new ones of these particular models, I don't think they would be concerned, as they've demonstrated with some of the new ones coming out of China today. But we'll discuss that in just a moment. So basically, these things were made and distributed illegally, and Nintendo just wanted to make sure that they weren't out there. They had a bunch of places, get rid of them, and there were some lawsuits, I believe. I'm pretty sure there was. And that was that. And this little mini console was no more. I actually owned one of these secondhand a couple years after all this went down, probably about 2008, 2009. And I bought it, I guess you could say it was new old stock at that point, 3 or 4 years before. I bought it at a flea market for like $20, and I actually had it for a long time, and eventually it broke, and I just threw it away. So they were not made very well. Some of them came with power adapters, some of them didn't. Some of them, you just got a battery pack and you put like, I think it was 4 AA's in it, and those would do you for like 2 or 3 months, depending on how much you played it. Sometimes only a few weeks if you played it a lot. And the mid 2000s were a wild west for trying to revive the whole retro gaming scene. So as we moved on into the 2000s, of course, you had AtGames who jumped up, I guess you could say, came onto the scene. They started releasing the Atari Flashbacks. Eventually, they released not only Atari Flashbacks, they started releasing a Sega Genesis. I can't even say Genesis. Sega Genesis. They released the Sega Genesis Flashback. And the interesting thing about the Sega Genesis Flashback, I guess you could call it a flashback, is it had a cartridge slot where you could play original Sega Genesis games on it, which was really interesting, because the first time I ever saw one in stores, I was like, whoa, you can play all your Sega Genesis games, all your original cartridges. The Sega Genesis is back in the production for the first time in years in the United States. This is awesome. It was awesome for about 2 years, and then kind of the whole thing about it wore off, the whole thrill of it, I guess you could say. But eventually, AtGames also released a Intellivision flashback, and even a ColecoVision flashback. Interesting side story about the Intellivision and the ColecoVision flashbacks. A local Family Dollar, back around 2015, couldn't get rid of them from the holiday season the previous year, and they were selling them for like $2.99 a piece. So this was when I first started my store. I came in and I bought up every single one from that Family Dollar, and then I went to another Family Dollar and found out that they were selling them too. I bought all those up, and then I went to another one and bought all those up. I must have had close to 100 of them, and I brought them in to my shop. First starting out, this was when I first started expanding, getting bigger as a retro gaming store. And I was selling them all day long at $9.99 a piece. I think I sold out of my entire stock within probably a month of Intellivision and ColecoVision, the retro mini consoles. And that was really my first big boost in the retro gaming industry, I guess you could say. Because even at $2.99, they were like, oh yeah, we've had these for, they were like, oh, we've had these for $2.99 for like 6 weeks now, and we've only sold like 3 of them. Nobody wants them. Well, it's because your typical gamer doesn't really stagger into a Family Dollar. I mean, unless they're really desperate for something from the bargain rack. Family Dollar, if you've ever been to a Family Dollar, they have a bargain rack where they have like pre-owned games or really cheap games. My local Family Dollar is still selling pre-owned PS2 games, like the Sing series. If you like Sing, they got probably close to around 30 copies of that. But then we move on to the NES Mini, which came out in 2016. I actually didn't get my hands on one the first production run. I had to wait till 2018 to get one. But these things were selling like crazy. You could not find them anywhere. Of course, when I ended up getting mine in 2018, I ended up getting a Super Nintendo Mini, I should say SNES Classic Mini, at the same time. And I, played both of them, and I honestly like the SNES Classic Mini better. I just think it has a better selection of games. I know the NES Classic, a lot of people loved it. A lot of people love the classic games on it, but I'm more of a Super Nintendo person. I think it's because it just has, the RPGs that I like. Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy III, Earthbound. One of my new favorites, I should say, from it, Star Fox 2, which is way more superior than the original Star Fox. It should have been released. Star Fox 2 should have been released. I mean, yeah, they would have had Star Fox 2 and Star Fox 64 come out, pretty close, but Star Fox 2 would have been a swan song for the Super Nintendo. It would have been an amazing game to have released. They should have released it back then. And then, of course, in 2019, you had the Sega Genesis Mini. I guess you could call it that. I know I've said that a lot, the switching between classic and mini. They're all minis, technically. The Sega Genesis Mini came out in 2018. 2019. It came out in 2019. And it was something we had heard about since 2018. And I don't own one, but I've been able to play one. And it's good. It's got, quite a few games built into it. It's a little bit better than the one that At Games released. About 5, 6, 7 years before. So it's just slightly better. Mostly because of the HD quality and whatnot. These are, as of this recording, still in the market. I don't know for exactly how long. It may be one of those deals that they suddenly just take it off the market, by the end of 2020. Or they may release a revised version of it with more games or different games. Most likely more games. They're probably not going to take any games away unless there's some kind of licensing issue. And of course also, currently, you have At Games who is still making mini consoles, and they're releasing their own mini console. It has a mixture of Atari, ColecoVision, NES, SNES, Sega Genesis games, and it's also got some homebrew stuff on it. I actually did a video on that about a month ago. I bought one from a local Walmart for I forget how much it was, $25, I believe. I did a video on that. You could check into that. But that pretty much is... I pretty much just cover the bulk of, I guess you could say, a brief history of mini consoles. It's mini consoles. I think they're going to be popular still. And I believe eventually everyone will get their wish to get an N64 Mini. I think eventually Nintendo's going to cave one day and say, you know what, we're developing one of these. It'll be out and blah, blah, blah. But I think if we do see one, the earliest we could possibly see one is 2022. Maybe 2021, fall of 2021. But if they decide to make one, I don't know. Nintendo may have gotten tired with the whole debacle. They may just say, you know what, we're not making any more. We're just going to release them on, Switch, that store. I'm not familiar with the Switch store for Nintendo Switch. I never use it. I use mostly PlayStation and Xbox, so, I mean, I have a Switch, but I never download any games on it. I just buy physical copies every chance I get. So, to answer the question that we asked at the beginning of the video, the answer to that question is yes, I absolutely believe that mini consoles or mini classic consoles or retro, whatever, you get the picture. You've been watching this long at this point. I do believe they will thrive. Not only that, I do think that we will get more of them out there. There's already the C64 Mini that's came out. Of course, there's also the TurboGrafx 64 Mini, or 64, TurboGrafx 16 Mini. So all those are coming out. So I think that we will be seeing a lot more mini dedicated retro consoles come out, over the next 2 or 3 years. It's 2020 as of this recording. If you're watching like 2025 and you're like, haha, he got it wrong, then, I got it wrong then. But I don't think it will be wrong. I think we will see him spike in popularity. And I do think by 2025, there will be a lot more of them out there. Unless everything goes digital. If everything goes digital, then you probably won't see them. You'll just have them on your console and you'll download them and yada yada yada. That'll be that, But I do think over the next 2 or 3 years we'll see a spike in them, and I believe that they'll find a very niche market that they'll wedge themselves into. And I think I absolutely think they will thrive over the next 2 or 3 years. I think people will continue to buy them. Nostalgia is continuing to grow. Of course, you have to look at the downsides of it. Every time that a mini console comes out, the market for that particular console, like for example the NES Mini, the collector's market for NES games virtually plummeted over a course of 2 or 3 months. The values of some of the games completely bottomed out. And that's the case with the Super Nintendo Mini. When it came out, Earthbound, very hard to acquire game. Value of it went down significantly overnight. I think it dropped by $100, $150 literally overnight. So that's really the only downside of the whole mini console thing. The collector's value of it goes down. Eventually the collector's value of stuff will, of course, rebound. Of course, it won't rebound until those particular mini consoles are off the market for at least 3 to 5 years before something really starts to rebound. Like, for example, Earthbound is just now starting to rebound in value after the release of the SNES Mini, after it's been off the market for over a year now at this point. So, that is pretty much my little rant on mini consoles. Yeah, that was probably one of my longer rants. I don't do videos over 30 minutes very often, but when I do, I babble on about a bunch of mini stories and many. I babble on about a bunch of side stories and whatnot. I guess you could call them side quests for your sake. I just think it adds to the whole ranting experience if you could hear someone's story and hear about their experiences. And I just think it really adds to the whole history of the matter. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell if you want notifications of when we release more awesome videos. And until next time, when we talk about something else, I will see you.